Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 21st, 1963, W. Norton publishes the enormously influential book, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Now, to be clear, we're fudging this date a little bit, as we sometimes do. It was published on February 19th, so I guess we can say that by this day, February 21st, second wave feminism was in full swing because for 2 days, women had been reading The Feminine Mystique. Look, this book was very influential, maybe not that influential, but it was a sort of mix of academic work and a lot of first-person narratives about the domestic life of women. And ultimately, it was a critique of a world in which women were defined by their domestic obligations. Friedan writes, quote, "The only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own." So let's talk about the publishing of The Feminine Mystique, second wave feminism, and the many ways this book has been evaluated, reevaluated, and reevaluated over the years. Here, as always, is Nichole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
And we have a special guest for this episode, Nichole Perkins, a writer, podcast host. Many of you may know her from the show Thirst Aid Kit. There's a new podcast called This Is Good For You, and Nichole is one of my favorite people in podcasting. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, good. So, Niki, where do you want to start? There's a lot of really interesting kind of demographic forces that I think lead to Betty Friedan writing this book.
Yes. I mean, things had changed significantly for women over the course of the 1950s, but especially for white women. 14 million girls by the end of the 1950s were becoming engaged by the age of 17. And so the average age of marriage just plummets. The average age of marriage in the U.S. in the 1950s is 20 years old. And it had been much higher than that before. So what we're seeing is women getting married a lot younger. The ones who had been going to college are dropping out along the way. And so the expectations for women that they would get married young, that they would only go to college in order to meet a man, that they would ultimately dedicate their lives to raising children in what was called homemaking at the time, that became, for many women, an overwhelming cultural force in the 1950s that Betty Friedan is writing against.
Yeah, and I should say that when the book debuts, it's a lot more scholarly than I think people expect. I think people expected it to be some sort of manifesto, but she's conducting numerous interviews and asking women, what does it mean to be a wife? What does it mean to be a mother? And what does it mean to be defined solely by your motherhood or your relationship to your husband? And so women talk about, how they were raised to raise their family and how they were raised to conduct a household and how so much of their identity is shaped around the home.
And that there's real dissatisfaction with that. I mean, the phrase that comes out of this book is the problem that has no name. And this idea that women in the U.S. are suffering from this cult of domesticity, but they're doubly suffering from the inability to actually complain about the problems that they have with it.
Nichole, have you read this book? Is this something that has influenced you, if that's the right word?
It has not influenced me, I don't think, at all. But I did read it. many, many years ago in college, when I was getting really into Black feminist theory and how a lot of Black feminist theory literature was kind of in response to the feminist mystique, just because Friedan left Black women out of the discussion. And I think it was really important for me to read the text so I can know more about what the criticism was from. And I think it's interesting that some of the criticism, aside from race, was the fact that Friedan kind of misrepresented herself when she was going about asking women about their experiences and saying that she too was a suburban housewife with 4 children when she was I think she actually had 3 children, and that she was very active in politics and, she was considered a very strong leftist and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of interesting to see that this book has a little cloud itself over it.
Yeah, that leveraging of the housewife identity is a thing that happens again and again in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Friedan was a journalist. She was a professional woman. And somebody later on, like Phyllis Schlafly, she'd always talk about herself as a housewife. But she was an author and a foreign policy expert and somebody who was running for Congress. But there was something about that housewife identity that offered a kind of authenticity in certain circles. And so you have that fudging of it. I don't think that Friedan necessarily thought of herself as a housewife, but she found it very useful to describe herself that way.
What's your sense of how quickly the pushback that you're starting to describe, Nichole, comes up?
I think it happened fairly quickly. I know that Bell Hooks in her book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, directly spoke to the book. And she asked, what's going to happen to the children and the households when these upper class white women go to work or go back to work or go back to school? Who's taking care of all of that? And, how do women of color, what are women of color supposed to do, who don't have the luxury of being housewives? What about them? So I think that pushback was fairly immediate from jump.
And I think this is true because it represents so much of sort of a tone-deaf analysis when you think about women of color and how women of color have always had to work. And especially during this time, the 50s and 60s, Black women, 8 out of 10 of them are domestic workers. And so they're working in the very homes, taking care of the children that Friedan is talking about. And so there's definitely this split in terms of, your complaints are about staying home, but you're not necessarily taking care of your home. Black women are and women of color are. And that discussion debate has continued throughout really the feminist movement, is how do we make sure that women of color's voices are not left out of the narrative?
And this is a pretty long-term problem. I mean, even if we go back to the 19th century and talking about the domestic sphere as the sphere of women, it was very much constructed on the idea of white women who were running the homes, even though, again, in a lot of cases, particularly among middle and upper class white women, they weren't actually the ones doing the work. And they had the option of not working out in the marketplace. And so it's been this problem for decades, if not centuries by this point, in the construction of what white womanhood is. So you have this book come along and it's replicating all of those same arguments. So it's pretty easy to spot by 1963 that Friedan is falling into some pretty endemic problems.
I did enjoy the pushback that Friedan gave to Freudian theories about women and women's sexuality and how it is not about penis envy and things like that. So I don't want to just fully chip away at the text, but I did like that she was kind of no, stop listening to Freud, he was terrible.
Yeah. And what's kind of great about that is that she's attacked by a publisher for being hysterical, and which is very much like a Freudian way of talking about why women be emotional, and so it's that standoff between Freud and she's really into Maslow's psychology plays out pretty pretty overtly.
Well, and the pushback isn't just from another publisher, but her own publisher actually sort of criticizes the book, and there's he's quoted as saying that the book is overstated at almost every point, yet entirely stimulating and provocative, which I guess means we're still going to put it out and try and make some money off of it. But I think, Kellie, I guess that's one of my big questions is how much, when you're tackling a question like the one that Friedan is tackling, how much is it going to be impossible to come up with sort of reductive, simplistic conclusions because it's just so fraught and complicated in the ways we've been discussing?
I think if she had started out the book just with honesty, like, I'm going to look at white middle-class women who stay at home, then I think people could have appreciated it for that specific lens. But I think it gets colored as this women's manifesto, which is meant to represent all women and all their, identities. And there's no book that's going to encapsulate that, first of all. But I think that because this book debuts at the time that it does, it really gets painted in these broad strokes, or allows women and their roles at home to be painted in these broad strokes that don't include a lot of people. And so now, I can say what I am grateful for is that I think that Friedan had opened up the door for other women to contribute their perspectives and their ideas, to be in conversation with her. Even if that conversation is a critique, it expanded the literature that we have on women's history and women's identity and women and gender studies, so that we can get these new voices.
Right, and that idea of breaking down silence, right, speaking about the problem that has no name, becomes a fundamental part of second wave feminism, that speaking your truth, talking about things that were verboten like abortion, was part of the process of engaging in feminist politics, because the silence itself had been part of the oppressive infrastructure that women were facing.
Yeah, the silence, something that's very important to me is making sure people stop feeling shame about their feelings. And so I think a lot of women were carrying shame, still to this day carry shame, when they realize maybe being a wife and a mother is not enough. Like, we are constantly being told that this is our sole purpose in life, and that can't be true. That just cannot be true. So I think, having this space to open up and name it and talk about it is very important. And I think that's exactly what the Feminine Mystique did, is opened up the conversation so that women could stop feeling shame about their emotions.
Mm-hmm. And also sort of express, the ability to scream and need help and say, this is not working, or there are times when I just don't like my kids, I think that honesty is also something that is greatly appreciated now, that women can actually be vulnerable in their motherhood and try to find some sort of remedy for that as well.
Nichole, you are such a good chronicler of lust and desire and pleasure, and seriously, this is why I love your work, and but I'm curious, kind of is that at all part of the conversation that's taking place in the early 60s in Friedan's work, and the conversation that breaks out from it? And if not, when do you see that to be something, to your point about opening up the doors for things that people are comfortable to express?
I'm not sure about that, because Friedan was very squeamish about homosexuality. And so if you branched into something that was not strictly hetero, if she got really weird and homophobic just about it. And it wasn't until much later, I think maybe 20 to 30 years later or something like that, that she was kind of she disavowed her, calling it the Lavender Menace, realized that we have to include everybody from all walks of life in breaking down these barriers for women. Looking at it through bell hooks and Paula Giddings and more like Black feminist theorists, but I don't know that anybody is pointing back to the Feminine Mystique as this is where I realized I could be a sexual person. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question very well. I'm sorry.
Maybe the short answer is no.
Yeah, because it's about it is more or less about housewife as a category and about labor and women's discomfort with their roles, but it takes another turn of the screw before you get to conversations about women's sexual pleasure and about all the mythology surrounding that. And consciousness raising groups and talking about dissatisfaction is one of the ways that you get to those broader conversations. So I guess if you want to trace a longer lineage, you might be able to get there. But it was not her primary concern.
Mm-hmm. Since we're marking the kind of publication of the book as the date that we're hooked to here, I mean, I want to return a little bit to kind of what this book meant in the moment. I mean, it was incredibly successful. It was on the bestseller list, and I am fascinated by this idea that it actually is a little more academic than people realize. And I think a lot of books that take off that way sometimes, like, I mean, I think, Niki, we've talked about, like, what was it? Thomas Piketty's, like, Capital. Like, everyone felt like they read that, but they didn't actually read it because it's, like, super dense and academic. But it, like, somehow...
Everybody read the first 10 pages
Exactly.
of it.
Like, it somehow injects into the discourse. And I guess that's, is that sort of your sense of what this book was? It was something that somehow gave shorthand and as opposed to something that, women all across the country were, like, reading in secret and actually going through and giving them sort of actual language to employ.
Look, I think it was a mix. There were certainly women who read it cover to cover. And it was also serialized or summarized in magazines as well. So it's one of those books, again, like Capital. You not only have the book, but you have all of the coverage of the book, which I think helps to spread those ideas and start conversations. So yeah, it might have been more dense than we normally think of, but there was a hunger for this sort of conversation, and there are ways that the ideas worm their way into the conversation for people who never even owned the book.
It's interesting to hear that it was considered so academic, or perhaps too academic, because it was also considered so angry and so girly. So like, I just think that people just didn't know how to attack it. They just wanted to attack it in any way that they could. So it's interesting to hear that people struggle to get through it because it was possibly too dense for them.
We should also say that because it has this standing as one of the books that helps to trigger second wave feminism, it has been considered by the right, as it was called in 2005, one of the 10 most harmful books of the 19th and 20th century.
Someone said that in 2005?
Like, yeah, Human Events.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
One of the 10
dangerous ideas.
10 most harmful books. I think I know what's at number one, right? I should hope so.
Capital, my man.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? It probably was the Communist Manifesto, not Mein Kampf, which is what should have been. But my God. Okay.
Gosh, number 7, yeah. 10 of the most harmful books, number 7 of the 19th and 20th century. Mm-hmm. It comes in at number 7. That's wild.
And it was 6 bell hooks books above that,
right? I'm going to go out on a limb and say Human Events did not do a lot of bell hooks reading.
Well, so on that note, as we wrap up, Nichole, do you want to sort of talk a little bit about, you've mentioned bell hooks, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other books that you feel like pick up this mantle but actually advance the conversation in interesting ways?
I would recommend When and Where I Enter by Paula Giddings, which is on my mind a lot, because basically it's about how breaking away from white supremacy and patriarchy and things like that, and like everyone having freedom, starts with the Black woman, basically. Once Black women are allowed to have these kinds of leadership positions like vice presidency or even the president or something like that, or they become the CEOs and they become like top in whatever field, then everyone else will come after. And it's kind of like, because a lot of people think that Black people are the lowest of the low. So if Black people can get to do this, everybody should be able to get to do it. And I would also recommend Words of Fire, which is an anthology of African-American feminist thought. And, these are older texts, yes, but they are very strong responses, I think, to a lot of what was going on in the 60s and 70s, part of the civil rights movement and part of the Black arts movement, and just really seminal texts that everyone should read, everyone should have on their bookshelves.
Yeah, I might add to that for a more recent book, something like Brittany Cooper's Eloquent Rage, that just kind of taps into the anger and women being able to express anger as an important part of feminism.
Yeah, I would say it's so funny. This semester I'm teaching Black women's history. And so a lot of the texts that you guys have mentioned are on my syllabus. I'm also, assigning a Black women's history of the United States, which is a book that came out last year. But it's really probably one of the first textbooks ever dedicated just to the history of Black women. And then I love anything with Audre Lorde. So I think all of that is really useful.
Great. Okay, well, we're going to leave it there in part because Nichole used the word seminal, and I was just waiting for someone to call something seminal, and then we knew that we could wrap up because, of course, that's what we're talking about.
There's Freud.
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, Nichole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And Nichole Perkins, thank you so much for being our guest here. And the new podcast is This Is Good For You, available, as they say, wherever you get your podcasts, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And what else you got going on?
I have a memoir coming out in August of this year, and it is called Sometimes I Trip on How Happy We Could Be. That is a Prince lyric from If I Was Your Girlfriend. So it is about growing up Black Southern and addicted to pop culture, basically.
Great. All right. Well, look out for that and listen to the podcast. But thank you again for doing this. This was really fun.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can follow us on social media at ThisDayPod, Twitter and Instagram. Our website is thisdaypod.com. You can read about us there. You can get in touch with questions or comments about the show or suggestions for topics. We always appreciate those. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I mean, the war between the sexes could become an Armageddon if we don't get on with our revolution. But if we do get on with it and we restructure society to make equality really possible, then I think in the largest sense, in the world sense, we'll be able to make love, not war.